Good evening from Bonner First Baptist Church, and on tonight's panel we have Dee Dee Martin will be doing the moderating, and Bo is going to join us. And I think this is an important subject to have a deacon and elder on because of the nature of the administrative duties of the church, and a very interesting, I think, take in this particular passage. So I'll let you start. I almost set something up, but I'll let you start and see where it goes. No, go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, the sermon title this morning was The Widow's List from 1 Timothy 4:11 through 5:16. Mm-hmm. And starting right off, in 1 Timothy 4:11, Paul is telling Timothy there needs to be authority in his teaching. In the NIV, the verse 11 reads, command and teach these things, right, referring to the Christian life. So I'll just lay the question out, and whoever wants to answer first is fine. How can ministers, Sunday school teachers, and Bible study leaders teach with authority?
That's a good question, Bo. I'll let you go first.
All right. Well, I guess let me say one thing in that regard. One thing, when I read some commentaries on 1 Timothy, it pointed out that obviously Paul is writing a personal letter to Timothy, but it's not just solely for his, benefit, for the benefit of the church. And so when he encourages Timothy to exercise authority and all this, again, it's probably encouragement to him, but it also, I think, lets the church know that Timothy is speaking under Paul's commission or endorsement or recommendation. And so even though it's specifically encouraging to Timothy to speak with authority, it lets those who listen to him know that he has that authority as well. So, but anyway, I guess for the church today, I think first thing, in order to speak with authority, it has to be proper preparation for that. And more than just knowing the material and the substance of it, I think the person needs to be prayed up and spiritually prepared, not just have the head knowledge, but can consider the audience. And I know Paul kind of refers to that in this passage, to consider the audience and who you speak to, but kind of be able to put themselves in the audience's shoes to know what can benefit them, and to just be able to relate to that as they try to speak with authority to them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, too, one thing I would say to kind of piggyback on that point, Paul says this authority you have comes from the laying on of hands. In this particular passage, he talks about the presbytery, and in chapter 1 of 2 Timothy, he talks about him personally laying hands on, and kind of the thought here is that Paul is part of the presbytery that does lay hands on Timothy. So I think one thing is the church recognizes who the gifted people are, and the church sets them aside and sets them apart for service. It's when someone asks for us to be in a position of authority, that to me is a red flag. I think that you have to, I think, be endorsed. He was endorsed by Paul and the church, and I think the church we study Paul, so we know what the qualifications are. And then we recognize in this person that they have the qualifications. I'd say the second thing, too, about what he said, going back to character issues. I think about men like Charles Wesley, who had just continual family problems and pressures, and Spurgeon, who had health problems and that kind of, and then the pressure of the downgrade controversy. And your life can be filled with pressure and filled with a lot of tensions, and yet when you come to teach or when you come to preach, at the end of the day, is your passion for Christ, is your passion for His church. And I think that is what matters.
In the sermon, it was mentioned that the church in Ephesus was having ethical challenges. Was the teaching of godly living a new concept?
I don't think it would have been a new concept for those who have been on the the law side of things, I mean, they would have always expected that you would do good deeds, and especially good deeds by the law. But when Paul talks about good works, he's talking about good works that result from who we are in Christ, not to have a relationship with Christ. I think if you look at it from the other way, from this pre-Gnostic thing that was growing in the church, they would be more prone not to have had or not to have believed in ethics like we know ethics, not Christian ethics. I mean, their ethics would have been much different. There were all kind of mystery religions and all that in that day, and so ethics would have been much debated, much like they are today. I mean, whose ethics? You know.
Yeah, I don't know specifically with regard to the church at Ephesus. I can't say I know, but one thing I do find noteworthy in these couple of chapters, in chapter 3 references it in chapter 4, that is not, I mean, certainly Paul is encouraging Timothy as he teaches and as he preaches to make sure to preach the truth and guard against heresy, but it's more than just teaching. He wants him to focus, like the passage today is set a good example. So it's not just mere knowledge, but it's going to be, you need to live it out. In the last chapter, he says, if I delay, I write these things so you know how to behave. Not just you know how to teach or preach or, you know, hold to those doctrines, but so you know how to live as an example to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more than, I think I read this in it may have been Matthew Henry's commentary, but he's encouraging him not to tear down with his actions what he's built up with his words in the lifestyle.
Yeah, I read Matthew Henry on that. I believe it was in there.
All right. In verse 12, Paul encourages Timothy to not worry about his age, but to be an example to his church in speech, life, love, faith, and purity. Why is godliness in the life of a believer so important?
I think because it goes back to Christ. And when you say godliness, you don't just mean as far as outward behavior, but then your dispositions in life as well. And I think that for a believer, the issue is the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, all those kinds of things. Because against such, there's certainly no law against that, and it shows something to the world that there genuinely has been a transformation brought about by the gospel. I think that's one reason it's so important.
One thing I think is interesting too, that there's no doubt that Timothy had these extraordinary gifts, and he refers to him with the laying of hands, and he's been blessed, and God has entrusted him. But when he encourages him, he, as you noted, he tells him to study, and so, and all these other things, practical things, the disciplines of godliness, and all this. So it's not, even though he had extraordinary gifts, he had to use the ordinary means of employing those gifts. It still required discipline, hard work, study, and all that. It wasn't, it's not just a mere gift that he did not have to exert any effort to be a good steward over.
Right, absolutely.
I think you already answered my next question, but I'll say it anyway. How can we as believers be good examples in those areas Paul lists in life, in speech, in love, faith, and purity?
Mm-hmm. And I think it goes back to the fruits of the Spirit and the other ethics that he talks about.
All right, in verse 13 and 14, Paul tells Timothy to devote himself to public reading of Scripture, preaching and teaching, and to not neglect his gift. And you spoke to it a little bit already, Bo. How as believers can we trust and be confident in our spiritual gifts to minister to the people around us?
I think we speak the gospel to each other, and if we do that, that requires that we know the gospel, because the gospel is always a great encouragement to believers. And also, then we practice, the works of charity toward each other. We just what he says in chapter 5, verse 1 of the next chapter, we encourage and comfort each other. Now, he speaks here specifically of older men and older women, but I think it's for everyone. So I think that's how I would see that.
Yeah, and he asked how to do it. Well, to me, I know it's kind of given a little less format to practice these things, but it would really, again, as Jesus boils it down to love for God and love for others. And if you follow those basic commands or those intentions of the heart, you're going to successfully complete these things as he writes about.
Yeah, I totally agree. Love for God is number one.
In 1 Timothy 5, Paul moves on to the topic of how to treat people in the church with respect as fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters. Then he moves on to the care of widows. And we see 4 types of widows that are mentioned. Widows who are truly in need with no family to support them. Widows with children and grandchildren. Young widows who could remarry. And widows who live for pleasure rather than for God. Or in the sermon you said, who are spiritually dead. Was Paul addressing a specific problem concerning widows in the church, or a possible rebuke to families to take care of their elders? Or is this, like you said, administrative guidance, or some of both?
Yes.
Yes.
I think it's all of the above. I think there was different things that he's writing to. I think the heart of it is the list itself, but there is a general sense in which the church has responsibilities and families have responsibilities, and he's laying these out and defining who the true widows are, and then defining who is qualified to be part of the church's ministry to families and widows, and especially women.
Yeah, and one thing I think is important to always keep in mind when we read an epistle, and when I spoke, I had referred to this, but to me it's always good to ask questions like who wrote it, which epistle, who wrote it, to whom was he writing, and then what was the occasion, what was the purpose. And some of those are easier to answer than others, and when we look at passages that are maybe kind of foreign to us, when we talk about a widow list and things, that there's this distance from the church that Paul was addressing here and in our church today, or the church today. So you got this kind of cultural distance with that, and so there can be uncertainty. And I know when you read epistles, in some passages can be kind of troubling because you're just hearing one side of the conversation. Like there's an occasion that gave rise to the letter. So it wasn't just
like
he's right.
1 Corinthians would be prime on that. Yeah.
Exactly, where there were specific problems in the church, and Paul addresses those problems. And even though we just see one side of the conversation, it's like listening to one side of the phone call. You can kind of derive what the conversation's about, but you don't hear the other side. And this, we don't know exactly, but there is obviously something going on in the church in Ephesus, maybe in general, but even, when you talk about administrative functions in the church, that when, like the origin of deacons was set up to address issues with regard to widows.
Exactly.
They had the little conflict between the Jewish widows and the Hellenistic, with the Greek-speaking widows, and so that's not something we can really relate to directly today, because that's not that big of an issue. But anyway, I say that because there is something distinct, and I'm sure Timothy knew exactly what Paul was talking about. With us, we kind of have to derive it from the context and the language and all the rest. So even though it may not be clear, we ought to take what is clear, focus on that, know that, and then what's unclear, maybe not, I don't know that we can be so dogmatic on it. But I said a lot, maybe to say not much. But anyway, so when it comes to that, I agree that I think it is kind of an example to follow, but it's not exactly like they were dealing with back in that church.
I got a lot out of what you said. I especially like the analogy of the telephone conversation. I don't know that have you ever heard that before? I don't think I'd ever heard that before. It really is like hearing someone talk on the phone, and you're hearing what they're saying. You're not hearing what the other person is saying, and so you're inferring a great deal from what is being said, but you don't know exactly. And I think that is a very good analogy of what goes on here, because we don't know. For example, in the letters to the Corinthians, we know that Paul has had a correspondence from the Corinthian church, but we don't know exactly what all's in that because we don't have it. And so that's a very interesting analogy, and I think a very good way of putting it, that we can glean a lot from this, but we really have to study context and other books, because we don't have the full picture.
All right, moving on. Verse 9 discusses requirements for the widow's list. This is similar to the previous list of overseers and deacons that we see in chapter 3. I saw a connection where in the overseers and deacons it said must be the husband of one wife or have one wife. And here the widow is to be faithful to her husband. NIV says faithful, or another translation says has had one husband. And I know I'm getting down in the weeds here, and there's probably not a good answer, but I'm asking the question anyway.
I think there might be a good answer.
Okay.
Ask the question.
Would a woman become ineligible for the widow's list if she has been widowed more than once?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the list where he's talking about that deacons have to be the husbands of one wife. I think it is that, and someone said in leaving this morning, she said, well, I guess I'll have to give up my position because she has been widowed twice, had two husbands who have died. And I said, I don't think so, because I think the issue here is that she was a one-man woman, that she loved one man, and I think that puts her above reproach. If in her life, she, in God's providence, married two men and was a good wife to two men, then, what's the difference?
Yeah, I think it really just shows kind of the mirror reflection of what was with regard to the qualifications of overseers and deacons, and they parallel one another.
Mm-hmm.
And because you could ask those questions with the overseers, and I referred to that, does that mean they have to be married, or if they're without the medical advancement, people did die at a young age, does that mean they shouldn't remarry, and all the rest? So there are questions when it comes to overseers and deacons, and I think you could ask those questions here. But really, that verse that you referred to, when I've only read this passage. I don't think I've ever studied it or had a Sunday school lesson or sermon on it. And so, in my mind, what was a widow's list, or those who were on the widow's list, were those who received.
That was my interpretation too.
Yeah.
When I wrote the title, that was what I thought.
But you can see when you make it parallel with the service of deacons and overseers that this may have been an administrative arm of the church,
Right.
and a ministry of the church, and those widows who serve on this list or serve these other widows or whatever. I don't know. That leads more to the notion that these are qualifications for serving.
It does, and there's two things when you read the list and then the qualifications, it's like you said, it parallels the bishop and the deacons. And then also you have this kind of list of officers in the church. Bishops, that he brought the message on bishops and deacons. And then there's this thing of the bishop addressing heresy that I preached on last week. And then, new office, this women's ministry that ministers to women and families. And it makes perfect sense. And it also, if you study the history of the church, that was something the church did. So, yeah, I thought it was fascinating.
All right. Paul encourages the young widows to not be put on the list as they have opportunity to remarry and have families. And this also helped them to guard against breaking their pledge. He mentions the pledge.
Mm-hmm.
Was the declaration of a pledge to remain single and serve the Lord a common thing to do for young widows as a means of support? And I have a second question.
It was not uncommon. I think that many of the younger widows did this. Going back to the age too, the age of 60 is pretty much a Greek idea. In Greek culture, it just became understood that 60 was like, that's when you're old. So I was reading, I don't know if it was Matthew Henry, but it might have been Matthew Henry. I don't know if you remember reading this, but he was saying 60, he says, the average person, he says, if you lived, the Bible talks about 70. He said, so if you're 35, you're middle-aged. 60 is really getting older, but I think it's just a number that is not necessarily arbitrary, but it's a number that is a benchmark kind of number, reference kind of number that would say, society would recognize that a 60-year-old woman would be a mature woman and would be thinking more of, life and the end of life more than what happens between now and the end of life. So the younger widows, I think, would be, and this is in 1 Corinthians 7, there was a precedent where they were making vows and pledges to serve the Lord. And then they would change their minds. And so the question was in 1 Corinthians, what should the father do? Should the father allow his daughter to remarry? And Paul said, sure, why not? So I think that's the big point in this, is that they would make these vows, but the younger women, it was harder for them to keep the vows. Although Anna married 7 years, then her husband died, and she kept the vow for 60-something years before Christ ever got here. I mean, she saw Christ and she knew he was the Christ. It's in Luke 2.
And that passage, it is interesting because it really is the picture of the widow. It's almost like not the prototype, but anyway, just the attributes he lists here. You can see she fulfilled in Luke 2. Mm-hmm.
The second part of this question is it crossed my mind. In that culture, would the deceased husband's family provide for the widow, or does the widow go back to her family? I know we probably don't know.
I think it would depend on the families, but it would probably more or less go back to the family of origin.
Okay. Because I know women didn't have a lot of support.
They did not have a lot of support.
Means of support.
Yeah.
It was also mentioned in the sermon that this text in 1 Timothy is not a social gospel text. Can you define social gospel?
Well, the social gospel is that, the church's mission is to help and feed and protect everyone. And the church can't do that to start with. I mean, should we be engaged in that? I think we should. But it's not our primary mission. And I think that's what you see shining through here. And it goes back to Galatians 6, where Paul says charity begins at the house of God. I think you see the importance of the church taking care of its own here. And then, if there are resources, and in time, the church was very good about this in the second century. One of the reasons the church spread was because of its charitable deeds, and Christians were putting themselves in harm's way to help others who had the plague and things like that. And so I think it's a good thing for the church to do charitable deeds. I'm 100% for that, but charitable deeds are not the main work of the church. The gospel is.
Yeah, no, I would agree with everything you said. And to me, this chapter kind of shows that Paul is saying before you use the church resources for this purpose, the family ought to take care of their own, and worse than an unbeliever if you can't provide for your own household. So it shows that's not the primary function, but yeah, it should be what the church is engaged in actively doing. But sort of like when you preach the series on what is the church, that's not the primary role of the church, but proclamation of the gospel and preaching and reading and teaching and praying.
Well, those are all the questions I have. If you'd like to speak to next Sunday and the text that you're going to be preaching from.
Well, next Sunday continues the administrative duties of Timothy that Paul is instructing him. In fact, through the rest of the book, it does this, and it only goes through chapter 6. I think, let's see, next week we are covering chapter 5, verses 17 through 25. So that will be, that's August.
End of the chapter,
yeah. Yeah, the end of the chapter. I somehow have skipped a Sunday in my notes, Bo. And that makes you and I have a question on when you will actually be preaching on October. You have the last sermon in the whole series. Well, no, I'll have Titus, but I don't. We'll do something. We'll make sure you're October the 30th. I'm going to actually be out September the 19th or the 18th, whenever. So I probably have somebody preach that Sunday, maybe skip a Sunday. That'll keep us on target for October the 30th. Okay. All right, Bo, would you close us in prayer, please?
Sure. Lord, we are thankful for this day. We are thankful for your word. And I just pray that by your Spirit, you would help us to just have a greater understanding of your truth. And by your Spirit, you give us a greater love for your truth, that you have revealed yourself through your word. And as we read and study your word, I pray that we would just have a greater experience of you in our lives, and that we would just seek to live out the truths of your word and be obedient to that. Thank you for the blessings you give us. I thank you for this church. Pray your continued blessing upon it and your leadership over it. And I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.